So good morning, everybody. My name is Faye Johnstone, as you just heard. My pronouns are she and they, and I am a queer, non-binary, trans-feminine young person with lived experience struggling with my mental health and trying to navigate mental health services as a queer and trans youth. I come to you today not as a researcher, but as a young person, as an activist and an advocate, and somebody who is very connected to the queer and trans young people in my community, and is very aware of how the services and supports that my community has access to are not supporting their needs or meeting their needs. And so I'm here to speak with you about stepping up on queer and trans youth mental health, because I think the intersection of queer and trans identities is something that we do not talk about enough in child and youth mental health services, despite the fact that queer and trans young people experience some of the most heightened risk of any community of young people accessing our services. I also am not quite, I have a buzzer thing. I was like, how do I change my slides? So before I get started, I'd like to read a statement that I try to read before I work with any service providers that just talks about, or helps frame what I'm here to speak with you about today. So queer and trans young people are beautiful, brilliant, insightful, powerful, caring, compassionate, and resilient. All too often when we talk about LGBTQ young people, we only talk about the heightened risk of mental health problems and suicide in particular that they experience, and we do not talk about the fact that queer and trans young people have survived and have built strong and vibrant communities in the face of systems of oppression and discrimination that have sought to erase their identities and erase their experiences. I think that we need to shift that discourse to talk about the amazing brilliance and the resilience that queer and trans young people have developed, and the fact that they are still here with us today, and the fact that they continue to push back against the systems in our societies that are not giving them space and are not validating and affirming their identities. Now, before I get into my presentation, I want to ground us in some key terms. I know that queer and trans young people are a population that we do not often talk about, and I want to make sure we all know the language that I'm using so we can understand my presentation. So when I say straight, I think this is a pretty basic one. Straight means somebody of one gender who is attracted exclusively to a person of the opposite gender. So we think of a man who is attracted to women, or a woman who is attracted to men. When I say queer, I'm talking about an umbrella term that includes everybody outside of that. So that includes people who are bisexual, who are pansexual, who are homosexual, or who are asexual. So it's a broad umbrella term that we use to describe everybody who falls outside of the heterosexual, straight norm. When I say cis or cisgender, this is a newer term that folks are maybe a little bit less familiar with, and it describes somebody whose gender assigned at birth is the same as the gender with which they identify. So when you're born, the doctor presents the baby to the parents, and based off of some random biological factors, they decide that baby is a boy or that baby is a girl. And then you're raised into that identity, and that is the box that you are made to fit into. And so when you are cisgender, it means that the doctor was right. It was like, this person has these little bits, must be a boy, and you grow up to identify as a boy or a man. When you are transgender or trans, it means that the gender you were assigned at birth is different from the gender with which you identify. So if you were born and the doctor's like, you have these bits, so you must be a boy, but you grew up and you're like, no, I'm not a boy. The doctor was wrong. And you identify as a woman. Or you identify as somebody who's non-binary, so neither box of man or woman, or agender. These are all identities that are outside of cisgender and fit under the umbrella of transgender experiences. Now, I included two more terms up here, heterosexism and cissexism. And this is language that I use to describe the way in which the systems that we live in create burdens and violence on queer and trans communities. So I don't want to talk to you about homophobia and transphobia. I want to talk to you about the way in which our social norms, the way in which our society's social structures privilege people who are heterosexual or straight and marginalize people who are queer. And that's heterosexism, the systemic normalization and privileging of heterosexual identities and the marginalization and oppression of anybody who doesn't fit into that box. And that's present in our media, that's present in the idea that somebody has to come out as queer or gay, and that we just assume that you're straight until proven otherwise. Now, cissexism is similar. It describes the presumption that one's gender assigned at birth is the gender with which they identify or will always identify. It is the presumption that when I walk into a room, if I am wearing masculine clothing, which I am very much not, if I am presenting masculinely, and if I have what we consider to be a male body, that I will be a man. And that if I am feminine, if I am wearing a dress, I will be a woman. So cissexism is the assumption and the normalization of being cisgender, and the marginalization of anybody who fits outside of that norm and that mold. Does this make sense? I'm seeing nodding, perfect. So I want to start by talking a little bit about what we know about LGBTQ youth mental health, because these statistics are quite honestly terrifying to me. What we know is that numerous studies, both in Canada specifically, but also across the world, have demonstrated significantly higher rates of depression, of anxiety, OCD, suicidality, self-harm, and substance use in LGBTQ young people, and specifically in trans and transgender young people compared to straight or cisgender youth. We also have very little research on queer and trans youth mental health, and so this study in 2010 by an organization called Trans Pulse looked specifically at the mental health and well-being of trans people, and trans young people in particular, and they discovered that 47% of trans youth in Ontario had thought about suicide in the preceding year. And an overwhelming and terrifying 19% had attempted suicide in the preceding year as well. So when I talk about cissexism and heterosexism and how these systems of discrimination impact us, this is one of the most tangible demonstrations of. The fact that suicide rates in queer and trans communities are this high is a direct demonstration of how our services, our systems, and our society is failing to support queer and specifically trans young people. We also know that when it comes to homelessness, 20 to 40% of homeless young people are LGBTQ identified. More often than not, that is because of the fact that their families are not accepting of their identities, and these young people, when they come out, do not have a place to stay. I can talk to you all day, and I would be happy to talk to you all day, about the terrifying realities of queer and trans young people. But this data is nowhere near a surprise to me, nor is it a surprise to the young people who are queer and trans that I work with, or the communities that I am a part of. We are aware of this in our core because I look around my friend group, which is predominantly queer and trans young people. I look around the social services that provide services to our community, and we are very aware of the suicidality, the self-harm, and the substance use that have riddled our community. I can't go a day without hearing about how these issues are impacting my community. And so I can talk to you all day, but we know this. This is innate. This is something that we have learned through our experiences growing up as ourselves and trying to assert ourselves in this world. Okay. I also think I want to add a bit of personal experience to this because I think that we talk a lot about queer and trans young people without talking about their stories and without realizing that the link to how our society deals with LGBTQ identities is directly related to queer and trans youth mental health. When I leave the house in the morning, I can very directly feel the way in which the way I present impacts the people around me. If I go outside presenting like this, I get stared at, I get growled at on occasion, I get yelled at, and that is not a unique experience. That is an experience that I have adapted to, and I'm very, very quickly learning to ignore in every way that I can. When queer and trans young people leave the house, we have this idea that our society is so inclusive and that it has come so far, but the reality is that they all too often face violence, they face erasure, and they are not safe to be in the communities that are built, that should be built to include our experiences. But there is hope. But I'm going to talk about some not so hopeful things first. So what's going on? What is the problem here? Why do we have queer and trans youth mental health statistics that are so overwhelming and that really terrify me to my core? Again, I want to directly link it with the way in which our society normalizes and privileges certain identities while erasing and oppressing others. We cannot talk about queer and trans youth mental health without placing the burden of that reality on the social systems that we all live in and that we all have a role in upholding. Too often, we only talk about how queer and trans young people are struggling, and what that narrative does is that places the blame on queer and trans young people. That says that their identities are the things that are causing their mental health problems, and we need to actively and intentionally shift that dialogue to talk about how the systems and the norms that we live in and support are creating the realities that lead to negative mental health outcomes for queer and trans youth. Whew. I talk quickly. I forget to breathe. Water is great. So that's one of the main things. I really like to emphasize that first and foremost, because I think that, more than anything else, leads to the realities that queer and trans young people experience. But we also know that mainstream youth mental health and social services are not currently equipped to adequately respond to the unique needs of queer and trans young people. I have heard numerous stories, and I don't need data to back this up because there are very few exceptions where queer and trans young people have the positive experiences that I would like to be able to share. Queer and trans young people, when they reach out for help, go into our traditional services and all too often do not receive the affirming support that they need. They are told that their identities are part of the problem, or they are in a role where they have to educate their service provider every single step of the way about what it means to be queer or what it means to be trans. When I access therapy services, every step of the way, it's me educating my service provider about my identity when I am there paying them to be helping me. And yet I'm spending half my session talking to them about what it means to be trans, instead of them helping me figure out what the hell it means to me to be trans. It's a dynamic that doesn't work. And so we need to shift the burden and place that burden on agencies to meet the highest bar of queer and trans inclusion. And the reality is that the history of mental health and LGBTQ identities is extremely terrifying. For the longest time, our identities were pathologized, our identities were medicalized, and service providers dictated what our identities meant to us. We had to fit in tight little boxes so that they could explain away our experiences and diagnose us with gender identity disorder, with sexual deviancy disorders, I believe. The list and the history of queer and trans young people and queer and trans communities broadly relating to mental health services is an extremely dark history. And we have come a very long way since then, but that reality still impacts queer and trans young people when they access services today. So when one of the young people that I work with accesses your services, it's not just in that instance, but it is a continuation of the history of violence that our social services and that our communities have enacted on queer and trans young people. And what that says to me is that our agencies have a fundamental obligation to set the very highest bar of queer and trans inclusion and queer and trans affirming care possible. Because the history of us working with queer and trans communities is very much the opposite of that reality. We need to do better because our young people deserve better. Whew. Finally, I don't think it is just enough to ask LGBTQ young people to integrate into mainstream services, because we don't just need mainstream services that are queer and trans affirming. We need specific services that meet the unique needs of queer and trans young people. Just like we need unique services that meet the needs of young people. There's a reason that we have a child and youth mental health system, and it's because we know that young people have specific and unique needs that are different from those of adults. Queer and trans young people have unique, specific needs within youth communities that are also in need of specific services. The availability of services specific to queer and trans young people today is extremely minimal. And the services that exist are usually underfunded and aren't supported to introduce evidence-based practices. And so these 3 points, to me, the first one is very much about grounding where the negative health outcomes come from, and the second two are about being honest about the reality of what services look like for queer and trans youth today. So we do have hope. There are steps being taken, and there are determinants of health for queer and trans young people that we can act on to lead to better health outcomes for queer and trans young people. First and foremost, we have family acceptance. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of family acceptance when it comes to queer and trans health outcomes. I referred to the Trans Pulse Project earlier, and they also looked at queer and trans youth mental health from a lens that looked at what do we need to do, like what is leading to the negative mental health outcomes. And what they discovered, if I can find my data, is that 50% of trans youth with unsupportive families, so families that were not supportive of their identities, had attempted suicide in the past year. whereas a significantly reduced 4% of trans youth with very supportive families had attempted suicide in the past year. So what that tells us is that trans young people, their mental health is massively determined by the supportive nature of their family. And so if we can build more supportive and accepting families, just like that, we will massively reduce suicide rates in trans communities. And while this study is specific to trans folks, that applies for queer folks too. If we can have queer and trans affirming families, we will see a massive reduction in suicide rates in queer and trans communities. Affirming identities and experiences is just as important. And when I say that, what I mean is it's counter to the everyday experiences that most trans and queer folks experience. I said experience too many times. So when I say affirming, I mean the very small act of gendering somebody correctly. The act of not getting put off when somebody shows up on stage wearing a dress when you might not expect them to. The act of letting folks have access to the washrooms that they need. So when I talk about affirming identities, that is in complete contrast to the realities that our young people experience, because more often than not, when we go out into a public space, there are presumptions made based off things that you would notice in a second that people use to misgender us, to erase our experiences. So more often than not, a trans person accessing washrooms, going out in public, they will be misgendered. And that reality is like a paper cut. And we use this metaphor a lot when we talk about bullying, but I think it's just as relevant here. Every single act of misgendering is a paper cut. It hurts a little bit. Usually you can get over it for that one time and you can move on. But when misgendering happens as often as it does today, when it's not just one paper cut but 1,000 paper cuts, you're now bleeding from your hand and you don't know what to do. If we can shift that dialogue and talk about affirming identities and experiences from the very get-go, so that the second that a trans person comes out, they are affirmed and validated in their experience, and folks do their best to get their pronouns right, to gender them correctly, and to use the right names, that will have a massive impact on trans health. Community. We need to build communities that are accepting of queer and trans young people, but we also need communities specific to queer and trans youth. It's not enough to say that we want queer and trans young people to be like in our generally very cisgender and heterosexual spaces and safe, but they need specific spaces for themselves to talk about their experiences, to learn and grow from those experiences. So community and access to community spaces where they can have role models, both young and old, to help learn and grow and unpack some of the very uncomfortable ideas that our society places on them will be a massive step forward. And safer schools. Safer schools is so important for queer and trans young people because so much of our social development happens in schools. If we can build schools that are safer and more validating of queer and trans identities, where young people can actually explore themselves instead of having to hide their identities for years on end, and where kids are encouraged to take that exploration and embrace it, young people will come out of their secondary and post-secondary education feeling like they actually know who they are and can engage and actively assert their identities. So I'm realizing that I did not time this well, so I'm going to go through a little bit quicker. So again, I can talk to you all day about queer and trans youth mental health, the statistics, and the work that's being done in our communities now, but I want to talk about my recommendations to you around what we can do to address this issue. So I want to talk about moving forward on queer and trans youth well-being and the role that service providers have to play in making this happen. First off, we need to build system-level capacity to respond to the unique needs of queer and trans young people. And so what I'm talking about there is that we need the provincial, the local, and the national institutions that we have for mental health, that we have for child and youth mental health, to really build capacity as a system to respond to queer and trans young people. Right now, we have incredible services across Ontario, at least. I can't speak for outside of. But those services aren't being shared. They're not being researched. They're not being evaluated. We're not taking those projects and growing them and saying this is a model that has a massive impact and we need to bring it somewhere else. And we also don't have system-wide capacity to do things like LGBTQ inclusion trainings. We don't have best practices in how to include LGBTQ young people in mental health services. If we don't have system capacity to respond to the needs of LGBTQ youth, we will continue to have small pockets of success, and we will not build a system that's really shifted to respond to these needs. We also need to engage queer and trans young people, organizations that work with queer and trans youth, and their broader communities and families in system transformation from the ground up. Just like we talk about in child and youth mental health, young people need to be engaged every step of the way because they know their experience is better than anybody else possibly can. And especially with queer and trans young people and the histories of queer and trans youth not being engaged and not being listened to by service providers, organizations have a heightened responsibility to work with queer and trans youth to co-create, co-develop, and co-implement services. Because I also can't speak to regions outside of my little town of Ottawa. We need young people to be engaged from the very grassroots, on the front lines, and then all the way up to those system-level organizations that we still need to have. We also need to implement queer and trans inclusion across agencies and youth-serving organizations. What that means is not just having one more workshop where somebody like me comes in and gives you a half-an-hour talk on how to be nice to the trans people. It means looking at how organizations operate as holistic bodies and shifting the internal culture and structures to be queer and trans affirming. It's not a rainbow sticker, it's about an entire cultural shift within an agency to embed queer and trans inclusion so that a year later, I'm not coming back and giving you another free 30-minute workshop on how to be nice to trans people. If we can start thinking about queer and trans inclusion through an implementation model that looks at shifting those practices, that's how we start getting somewhere so our agencies don't need to keep refreshing themselves every time they hire a new employee. The practices need to be embedded. They need to be at the very core of how organizations work. And finally, and I think I want to highlight this one in particular, we need funding for services specific to the unique needs of queer and trans young people and their families. And what that looks like in action is mainly two things. We need family support groups and supports through counseling, through therapy, through any kinds of mechanisms to help families shift and understand how to work with their young people. Too often, families are left out in the cold. They don't have access to somebody who can hold their hand through the scary experience that is having a kid come out as trans. Because when a kid comes out as trans, you're scared of, okay, what does this mean to me? But you're also scared of, what does this mean to them? We know that we live in a transphobic society. We know that we live in a society that's not friendly to trans people. Parents need somebody to help walk them through how they can support their kids, and they need parents who they can gather with to learn from and share those experiences. And it's different with every kid, and so they need that hands-on support. Queer and trans young people need access to gender-affirming therapists and therapists who are aware of what gender means and who are able to have that conversation and help them sort out their identities. When I was first going through the process of coming out as trans, I had nowhere to go. I couldn't talk to my therapist because I was talking to my therapist and explaining these basic ideas to begin with. We need folks who are able to give that basic education and support to trans young people. And we also need spaces that are peer support based for queer and trans youth. We need spaces that young people can come to and say, I have no idea how to come out to my parents. I have no idea how to come out at school. What does it mean? How do I access transition services? How do I access healthcare? None of that infrastructure currently exists. Okay. More than anything else today, I'd like to leave you with the message that we need a systems response to a systemic problem. We are dealing with a child and youth mental health crisis, but we are also dealing with a queer and trans youth mental health crisis. I am tired. I am tired of coming in front of audiences and talking about the community that I am a part of and the struggles that they live with every day of their lives. And so what I want you to do leaving this room is I want you to take that burden, take that responsibility of advocacy on, and carry it back to your organizations. Queer and trans young people in particular have had to carry this work forward because we are the only ones doing it, alongside some very brilliant queer and trans service providers and some great allies. But we need more allies. We need more people who are thinking less about queer and trans identities as something that happens and needs to be talked about just on the front lines. And we need people who are thinking about queer and trans experiences and supporting queer and trans youth across our systems and shifting how our services work to better include queer and trans youth. Thank you.